The warning signs are everywhere, but nobody wants to see them. Stock markets hit records while unemployment quietly climbs. Corporate profits soar as ordinary workers get pink slips. Politicians promise prosperity while the foundation cracks beneath our feet. We're living through the opening act of an economic collapse, and most people are too busy watching the theatre to notice the building is on fire. This isn't about distant theories or academic models. This is about what's happening right now, in 2025, as the American economy stumbles toward the edge of a cliff that most experts refuse to acknowledge exists. The numbers don't lie, even when the headlines do. And if you understand what those numbers really mean, you'll see that we're not heading toward a recession. We're already living in the early stages of something much worse. The illusion of strength is the most dangerous economic lie of all. We measure success by stock prices that float on printed money. We celebrate job reports that hide mass layoffs behind seasonal adjustments. We trust institutions that have spent decades hollowing out the very foundations they claim to protect. But illusions always shatter, and when this one breaks, the debris will bury everyone who believed the performance was real. Here's what the mainstream won't tell you. The United States economy isn't growing. It's consuming itself. The jobs being created are service positions that pay less than the manufacturing jobs being destroyed. The wealth being generated flows upward to asset holders while wages stagnate and prices climb. The government spending that props up growth comes from debt that can never be repaid. We're watching a controlled demolition disguised as a construction project. The labor market tells the real story if you know where to look. Headline unemployment sits at 4.3%, a number that sounds manageable until you dig deeper. More than 1.9 million Americans have been unemployed for at least 27 weeks. That's the highest level since the pandemic and double what we saw just 2 years ago. These aren't people between jobs. These are people the economy has abandoned permanently. What makes this terrifying is who's being left behind. College graduates now make up over 30% of the long-term unemployed. These are people who followed every rule, earned degrees, and built careers, only to discover that automation and economic restructuring have made their skills obsolete. When the educated middle class can't find work, the foundation of consumer spending collapses. And when consumer spending collapses, everything else follows. The corporate world is sending signals that should make everyone nervous. Amazon announced 14,000 job cuts in a single week, citing artificial intelligence as the reason. UPS eliminated 48,000 positions from its workforce in a year. These aren't struggling companies making desperate cuts. These are profitable giants reshaping their operations around machines instead of people. The message is clear. Human labor is becoming optional. Since January, over 4,200 companies have announced mass layoffs. That's not a recession pattern. That's a fundamental shift in how the economy operates. Companies are discovering they can maintain or increase profits while employing fewer people. Technology isn't creating jobs to replace the ones it destroys. It's concentrating productivity into fewer hands while leaving millions without income or purpose. The federal government is making the situation worse through its own workforce reductions. Nearly 300,000 federal civil service positions have been targeted for elimination, with almost 200,000 workers already gone. These cuts ripple through local economies, especially in regions dependent on government employment. When federal workers lose their jobs, they stop spending at local businesses. When local businesses lose customers, they cut their own staff. The spiral accelerates. But the real economic bomb is the tariff policy that's reshaping global trade. The United States now faces its highest tariff levels since 1933, with an average rate of 18.6%. These aren't just numbers on imports, they're taxes on every American household, estimated to cost families nearly $1,300 this year alone. The burden falls hardest on working families, who spend the largest portion of their income on goods that have become more expensive overnight. Manufacturing is collapsing under the weight of these trade policies. 4 straight months of manufacturing job losses paint a picture of an industrial sector in free fall. Companies that built supply chains over decades are watching them disintegrate as tariffs make their operations unprofitable. The automotive industry reports billions in tariff-related costs that eventually get passed to consumers through higher prices. This creates a vicious economic cycle. Higher prices reduce consumer spending power. Reduced spending forces businesses to cut costs through layoffs. More unemployment means even less spending. The spiral feeds on itself until something breaks catastrophically. We're seeing the early stages of this process play out in real time. The Federal Reserve finds itself trapped between impossible choices. Raising interest rates to fight inflation risks pushing the economy into recession. Cutting rates to prevent recession risks making inflation worse. The central bank's traditional tools are useless when the problem isn't too much demand or too little supply, but a fundamental restructuring of how the economy operates. Meanwhile, financial markets exist in a fantasy world disconnected from economic reality. Stock valuations match levels seen during the dot-com bubble. Corporate bond spreads sit near all-time lows, suggesting investors see no risk anywhere. House prices remain at record highs, while unsold inventory builds to levels not seen since 2009. The disconnect between asset prices and economic fundamentals has reached dangerous extremes. Regional economies are already showing signs of serious stress. States representing nearly one-third of national economic output are either in recession or at high risk of entering one. California and New York, the economic powerhouses that drive much of American growth, are struggling to avoid contraction. When these states fall, their problems spread nationwide through interconnected financial and trade networks. The global economy is beginning to feel the effects of American economic weakness. International growth forecasts have been revised downward as trade disputes reduce global commerce. European activity has slowed significantly, while emerging markets face capital flight as investors seek safer assets. What begins as domestic economic trouble rapidly becomes international contagion in our interconnected world. History shows us that economic collapses don't announce themselves with dramatic headlines. They begin with subtle shifts that most people ignore until the damage becomes irreversible. Employment patterns change, trade relationships break down, asset prices lose connection to underlying value, government policies create more problems than they solve. These are exactly the conditions we face today. The most dangerous part of our current situation is the widespread belief that someone else will fix the problems. Politicians promise solutions they can't deliver. Central bankers claim they have tools they don't possess. Corporate leaders focus on quarterly profits while long-term sustainability crumbles. Everyone assumes the system will hold together because it always has before. But systems don't survive on assumption. They survive on fundamentals, and those fundamentals are rotting away beneath our feet. What we're witnessing isn't a temporary downturn that will correct itself with time. It's a structural transformation that's destroying the economic model that created middle-class prosperity for generations. The jobs being eliminated won't return. The industries being automated won't rehire. The trade relationships being severed won't automatically repair themselves. We're living through the end of one economic era and the beginning of something entirely different. The collapse isn't coming, it's here. It's unfolding in employment statistics, corporate earnings reports, and government policy decisions that most people never see or understand. By the time the crisis becomes obvious to everyone, the opportunity to prepare will have passed. The question isn't whether the economy will collapse, but whether you'll be ready when it does. The banking sector is showing cracks that should terrify anyone who remembers 2008. Financial institutions are caught in a squeeze between rising loan defaults and compressed profit margins. As unemployment climbs and businesses fail, banks face mounting losses on commercial real estate, corporate lending, and consumer debt. The private credit market, which has exploded in size over the past decade, represents a massive blind spot in the financial system. These less regulated lending arrangements lack the capital reserves to weather economic storms, yet they've become critical sources of funding for over-leveraged businesses. Credit spreads remain artificially low despite mounting economic stress, suggesting investors haven't grasped the severity of what's unfolding. Banks are pretending their loan portfolios are healthy, while quietly tightening lending standards and hoarding cash. Small businesses report difficulty accessing credit, even as their revenues collapse from reduced consumer spending. The disconnect between market confidence and economic reality creates the perfect conditions for a financial shock that will catch everyone unprepared. Consumer debt levels have reached unsustainable heights just as incomes stagnate and unemployment rises. Households that loaded up on credit during the boom years now face the impossible choice between making payments and covering basic expenses. Credit card delinquencies are climbing, auto loan defaults are accelerating, and mortgage stress is building in regions hit hardest by layoffs. The consumer spending that drives 2/3 of economic activity is about to crater as families exhaust their financial reserves. The housing market presents another disaster waiting to happen. Prices remain near record highs while demand evaporates. New home inventory is building to levels not seen since the last crash, yet builders continue constructing properties they can't sell. Mortgage rates have made homes unaffordable for most buyers, while existing homeowners find themselves trapped in properties they can't afford to maintain. The wealth effect that drove spending during the housing boom is reversing as property values begin their inevitable decline. State and local governments are discovering that their revenue projections were built on economic growth that no longer exists. Property tax collections are falling as real estate values stagnate. Income tax revenues are declining as unemployment rises and wages fail to keep pace with inflation. Sales tax receipts are dropping as consumers reduce spending on everything except essentials. Municipalities that expanded services and took on debt during prosperous times now face impossible budget shortfalls. The response from government officials reveals how little they understand what's happening. They announce infrastructure spending programs that take years to implement while the economy needs immediate relief. They propose tax cuts that primarily benefit wealthy investors while working families lose their jobs. They create new regulations that burden struggling businesses while doing nothing to address the structural problems destroying the middle class. Every solution makes the underlying problems worse. Supply chain disruption has moved beyond temporary inconvenience to permanent restructuring. Companies that spent decades building efficient global networks are watching them collapse under the weight of trade wars and policy uncertainty. The just-in-time inventory systems that maximized profits during stable periods have become catastrophic vulnerabilities during disruption. Businesses are discovering they can't simply flip a switch and rebuild domestic production capacity that was dismantled over generations. Manufacturing states are experiencing economic devastation that mirrors the industrial decline of previous decades, but compressed into months instead of years. Michigan has officially entered recession as automotive companies struggle with tariff costs and changing technology. Ohio and Pennsylvania are following the same path as steel and manufacturing operations become unprofitable. These aren't temporary adjustments. They're permanent closures of facilities that employed thousands of skilled workers who have nowhere else to go. The ripple effects spread through communities like a slow-motion disaster. When a major employer shuts down, it doesn't just eliminate those jobs, it destroys the local businesses that depended on those workers' spending. Restaurants close, retail stores empty, service providers lose customers. Property values collapse as people flee areas with no economic opportunities. Tax bases shrink, forcing cuts to schools and public services that make the communities even less attractive to new businesses or residents. Healthcare costs are accelerating just as millions lose employer-provided insurance through layoffs. Families choosing between medical care and rent payments discover that economic collapse has a human face. Emergency rooms fill with people who can't afford primary care. Mental health services are overwhelmed as financial stress drives depression and anxiety to epidemic levels. The social safety net, already strained by previous crises, buckles under the weight of mass unemployment and economic desperation. International markets are beginning to question the stability of dollar-denominated assets as American economic weakness becomes undeniable. Foreign central banks that held treasury bonds as safe investments are discovering that safety is an illusion when the underlying economy is contracting. Currency markets are starting to price in the possibility that American economic dominance is ending, not temporarily pausing. The global reserve currency status that has allowed the United States to export its inflation and import cheap goods for decades is under threat. Energy markets reflect the broader economic chaos as demand destruction meets supply disruption. Industrial facilities shutting down reduce electricity consumption, while transportation slowdowns cut fuel demand. Yet prices remain elevated due to supply chain problems and geopolitical instability. The energy sector, which employs millions directly and indirectly, faces a future where demand patterns have permanently shifted while infrastructure investments become stranded assets. Agricultural regions are caught between rising input costs and falling commodity prices as global trade relationships deteriorate. Farmers who borrowed against land values that are now declining face bankruptcy as export markets disappear behind tariff walls. Food processing facilities are closing as labor costs rise and demand patterns shift. The result is higher food prices for consumers, even as agricultural producers struggle to survive. Rural communities that depend on farming are experiencing economic collapse that urban areas don't yet recognize. The education sector faces a crisis as families can no longer afford college tuition while student loan defaults accelerate. Universities that expanded during prosperous decades now confront declining enrollment and mounting debt. The promise that education guarantees economic mobility has been exposed as fiction when college graduates can't find employment. An entire generation is discovering that the economic rules they were taught no longer apply to the world they're entering. Technology companies that seemed immune to economic cycles are announcing massive layoffs as venture funding dries up and consumer demand collapses. The artificial intelligence boom that justified enormous valuations is revealing itself as another speculative bubble as companies discover that automation reduces their customer base along with their labor costs. Silicon Valley, once synonymous with endless growth and innovation, is experiencing its own version of economic reality as easy money disappears and actual profits become necessary for survival. What makes this collapse different from previous recessions is its comprehensive nature. Every sector, every region, every economic class is feeling the impact simultaneously. There are no safe havens, No industries that remain healthy while others suffer. The interconnected nature of the modern economy means that weakness in one area rapidly spreads everywhere else. The collapse isn't coming in waves. It's happening all at once, overwhelming the systems designed to contain economic damage. The psychological impact of this comprehensive breakdown cannot be underestimated. When people lose faith in the economic system's ability to provide opportunities and security, they change their behavior in ways that make the crisis worse. They stop spending, stop investing, stop taking risks that drive innovation and growth. The confidence that underpins every economic system evaporates, leaving behind fear and paralysis that can persist for generations. The warning signals from major financial institutions reveal how desperate the situation has become. JP Morgan now assigns a 40% probability to recession by the end of 2025, a figure that represents careful analysis of deteriorating conditions across multiple economic indicators. This isn't speculation from fringe analysts. This is mainstream finance acknowledging what the data has been screaming for months. When institutions that profit from optimism start preparing for contraction, you know the foundation is cracking beyond repair. Economic growth projections tell the real story behind the cheerful headlines. The United States economy is expected to expand at just 0.25% in the second half of 2025, a rate so anemic it barely qualifies as growth at all. This represents economic stagnation disguised as stability, the kind of performance that historically precedes dramatic collapse. An economy growing at 0.25% annually is an economy that has already stopped functioning properly. The manufacturing sector provides the clearest picture of what's happening beneath the surface. 4 consecutive months of job losses in manufacturing represent more than cyclical adjustment. They signal the death of American industrial capacity under the weight of policies that make production unprofitable. When factories close, they don't just eliminate jobs. They destroy entire ecosystems of suppliers, contractors, and service providers that depend on industrial activity. The ripple effects spread through communities like a slow-moving disaster that leaves nothing intact. States representing nearly 1/3 of national economic output are either in recession or teetering on the edge. California and New York, the economic engines that power much of American prosperity, are struggling to maintain growth as businesses flee and tax revenues collapse. When these states fall, their problems don't stay contained within their borders. They spread through financial networks, supply chains, and labor markets that connect every region of the country. Michigan has already crossed the line from struggling to recessionary as automotive companies buckle under tariff pressures and technological disruption. The state that symbolized American industrial might is becoming a monument to economic decline. Ohio and Pennsylvania are following the same trajectory as steel production becomes unprofitable and manufacturing operations relocate or simply shut down. These aren't temporary setbacks. They're permanent destruction of industrial capacity that took generations to build. The federal government's response reveals how little policymakers understand the forces they're dealing with. Cutting 300,000 federal jobs during an economic downturn is like removing the foundation while the building is already shaking. These aren't just government positions being eliminated, they're paychecks that supported local businesses, mortgages that kept banks solvent, and tax payments that funded municipal services. Every federal worker laid off creates a cascade of economic damage that multiplies throughout their community. Labor market deterioration has reached levels that should trigger emergency policy responses, yet officials continue pretending the situation is manageable. Construction, manufacturing, technology, finance, and professional services are shedding jobs while only healthcare and hospitality continue hiring. This sectoral imbalance reveals an economy in the process of fundamental restructuring, not temporary adjustment. When high-skill, high-wage industries eliminate positions while low-skill, low-wage sectors expand, the entire economic model is breaking down. The rise in long-term unemployment among college graduates exposes the myth that education provides economic security. When people with advanced degrees can't find work for months or years, it means the economy has stopped creating the kinds of jobs that sustain middle-class prosperity. These aren't people between positions, they're people the new economy has no use for, despite their qualifications and experience. Corporate America is sending unmistakable signals about where this is heading. Amazon's elimination of 14,000 positions in favor of artificial intelligence isn't cost-cutting. It's a preview of how major employers plan to operate with far fewer human workers. UPS reducing its workforce by 48,000 people in a year demonstrates that even logistics companies, which seemed immune to automation, are discovering they can function with dramatically smaller payrolls. The scale of corporate downsizing in 2025 has already surpassed anything seen since the pandemic crisis. Nearly 950,000 job cuts announced through September represent a fundamental shift in how businesses operate, not temporary adjustments to economic conditions. When companies can maintain profits while employing fewer people, they will choose that path regardless of the social consequences. The market rewards efficiency, not employment. Small and medium-sized businesses face impossible choices as costs rise and revenues fall. Tariffs have increased their input costs while reducing their customer base as consumers cut spending. Many are discovering their business models are no longer viable under current conditions. Unlike large corporations that can absorb losses temporarily, small businesses fail quickly when their margins disappear. The entrepreneurial sector that creates most new jobs is being systematically destroyed. Banking sector stress indicators suggest the financial system is more fragile than anyone wants to admit. Credit spreads remain artificially compressed despite mounting evidence of economic weakness, indicating investors haven't recognized the severity of what's unfolding. When reality finally penetrates market psychology, the adjustment will be sudden and severe. Banks that appear healthy today are carrying loan portfolios that will become worthless as businesses fail and unemployment rises. The private credit market has become a massive source of systemic risk that regulators don't fully understand or monitor. These less regulated lending arrangements have grown explosively during the boom years, providing capital to businesses that couldn't access traditional bank financing. When economic stress tests these arrangements, many will prove inadequately capitalized to survive losses. The resulting failures could trigger a credit crisis that makes 2008 look manageable. Consumer debt levels have reached breaking points just as incomes stagnate and employment becomes uncertain. Households that borrowed against rising home values and stable employment now face payments they can't make on assets worth less than their debt. Credit card delinquencies are climbing as families choose between making minimum payments and covering basic expenses like food and housing. The consumer spending that drives economic growth is about to collapse under the weight of unsustainable obligations. Housing markets are showing classic bubble characteristics as prices remain elevated while demand evaporates. New home inventory is building to levels not seen since the last crash, yet construction continues because builders can't pivot quickly enough to changing conditions. The wealth effect that encouraged spending during the housing boom is reversing as property values begin declining. Homeowners are discovering their primary asset has become a liability that traps them in place. State and local governments are facing budget crises as tax revenues fall short of projections based on continued growth. Property taxes are declining as real estate values stagnate. Income taxes are dropping as unemployment rises and wages fail to keep pace with inflation. Sales taxes are falling as consumers reduce discretionary spending. Municipalities that expanded services and borrowed against future revenue now confront impossible choices between essential services and debt payments. The international dimension of this crisis is becoming impossible to ignore. Global economic growth has been revised downward to 1.4% in the fourth quarter of 2025, reflecting how American economic weakness spreads through interconnected trade and financial relationships. European economies are particularly vulnerable as tariff policies disrupt established commercial patterns. Emerging markets are experiencing capital flight as investors seek safety in assets that may not actually be safe. Currency markets are beginning to question the stability of dollar-denominated investments as American economic fundamentals deteriorate. Foreign central banks that accumulated treasury securities as safe assets are discovering that safety depends on underlying economic strength, not just government promises. The reserve currency status that has allowed America to export inflation and import cheap goods for decades is under pressure from economic reality. Energy demand destruction is accelerating as industrial facilities shut down and transportation patterns change permanently. While supply disruptions keep prices elevated, the underlying trend is toward reduced consumption as economic activity contracts a future where demand patterns have shifted. The energy sector faces permanently, while massive infrastructure investments become stranded assets. Oil refineries, pipelines, and power plants built for an economy that no longer exists will become monuments to miscalculation. Agricultural regions are caught between rising input costs and disappearing export markets as trade relationships deteriorate. Farmers who borrowed against land values that are now declining face bankruptcy as tariff wars block traditional sales channels. Food processing facilities are closing as labor costs rise and demand patterns shift toward cheaper alternatives. The result is higher food prices for consumers, even as agricultural producers struggle to survive. Rural communities dependent on farming are experiencing economic devastation that urban areas haven't recognized yet. When agricultural businesses fail, they take with them the banks, equipment dealers, and service providers that support farming operations. Small towns lose their economic base while residents flee towards cities that may not have opportunities for them either. The demographic and economic hollowing of rural America is accelerating beyond anything seen in previous decades. Healthcare systems are buckling under the pressure of increased demand from economic stress while funding sources disappear. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed by people who can't afford primary care but can't ignore medical problems. Mental health services are swamped as financial anxiety drives depression and substance abuse to epidemic levels. The social safety net is discovering that economic collapse creates health crises that compound the original problem. The collapse is already here, unfolding in real time while most people cling to the illusion that someone else will fix what's breaking. The warning signs aren't subtle anymore. They're everywhere, from empty factories to overflowing unemployment lines, from failing banks to crashing supply chains. This isn't a recession coming down the road. This is the disintegration of the economic system we thought was permanent. The question isn't whether you'll be affected. The question is whether you'll be prepared when the last illusions finally shatter. History has the answers if you know where to look.